everyone, welcome back to this is kind of like a bit of a special episode of Grow Your Tutoring Business, because we're not really going to be talking about
it's a special needs episode.
We're not really going to be talking about that at all. Now, some of you will have heard this name because I've spoken about Tom before, but this is Tom Delahunt, and behind me you'll see this book that pretty much appears in, I'll probably say 95% of my videos, because it's always in the background. And Tom's got something really special to share, and we're not going to be able to capture it all in this podcast just because there won't be enough time. But I'm excited about talking to Tom because there's a lot of values and ethics that's going to come out of our discussion, which will help people, but also lots of people will resonate. And there's an underlying theme and thread of education. That's kind of like the center of the fuel of where... I don't want to put words into your mouth, actually, Tom. So why don't I be quiet for a bit and welcome you, and just tell us a little bit about who you are and your journey over the last couple of years, and then I'll kick off with a question of what education was like for you.
Okay, perfect. So what I'll do is I'll do it longitudinally. So I was a child who spelt my name Mott. Right, and then what happened is I continued to sort of not really sort of flourish within the educational sphere. I found kind of maladaptation more kind of comfortable. Then I started to find a sense of meaning through doing alternative jobs and trying things and failing, eventually falling into nursing, where I then spent a significant period of my time professionally and still really want to get back to as a poet within hospitals. Working with the most unwell people, so trauma responses, both here and in New Zealand. That then led me into teaching, which then led me to completing a number of postgraduate studies, which I achieved a master's at distinction. But again, understand that I don't consider myself an academic. I consider myself a vulgarist and a rebellious researcher. And then all the way up to the point now as an author of The Wandering Lamb, a poet in residence at a number of schools. And what I've sort of thought of today, and I'm writing a piece of work about, which is that I believe that I'm probably likening my journey of legacy towards a polymath. So someone who loves the interrelationship between multiple spheres of thinking, because I love spirituality and the thoughts around spiritual spaces. I also love the thoughts of academic and harder sciences. And those are sort of combining now in something quite rich, which is what we were talking about before the podcast, which is where your audience sings your song back to you, like when the Foo Fighters have that moment where the audience sing it back. And I've been there, and it's something really special. And there's a poem here from some children at Bridge School who I'm working with. I'm now a poet in residence for 5 schools in Kent, where we're trying to look at embedding values around something that is central to all of my work, which is the thread of consciousness, but also this position of psychological safety. That's the absolute mandate. Where can we create cultures of psychological safety?
Do you think that's a really good link into, or I believe it will be, into your experience at school? Like you said at the beginning about like writing your name backwards, which then led down a path where you didn't really feel like the education system was there for you, right? You felt you set outside of the educational system almost. And that's like the opposite of psychological safety, isn't it? When you suddenly don't feel like you belong somewhere, and actually you really feel like on the outside. There will be lots of people listening who, and I believe this with most teachers or people in education, not just qualified teachers, but those support workers as well. That we all have connections with these types of children or young people, or even work alongside adults who display in a similar way. Like, how do we create these safe spaces? How do we actually, one, create them and then maintain them and sustain them over time?
So I basically have recognized that the journey that I've kind of undergone, if you want, is not dissimilar to a lot of children, where they are, and I found my reports from when I was at my my primary secondary school, secondary school reports suggesting that, you know, I was chatty, that my grammar was poor, that I needed to gain more confidence, you know. And it was very kind of old school thinking of like, you know, why haven't you managed this yet? But unfortunately, I know those languages of self-deprecation are still spoken over children, because I created an art gallery from my dyslexia assessment, which I only got when I was 40 years old, and I'm still awaiting statementing for ADHD and autism, frontal behaviour patterns and associated behaviours. So I recognised that that child that was still having those conversations with educationalists is not a rarity. And places of psychological safety really are based around arts. Arts are the humanity's response. And I've just written a piece that's awaiting reviewing with a publisher, which is around art as resistance. Now, I'm hoping maybe to kind of combine my PhD with the University of Arts London. We're waiting for Cambridge University potentially to examine. So there's lots of these multiversal kind of realms that I sort of sit myself in, but that doesn't conform to a normal linear pattern of education. And obviously I failed my A-levels. I had to do a BTEC. I failed my degree on the first occasion because I just couldn't. And it was as if, you know, I was told as I was walking out the door, you know, by the way, you might want to get assessed because you might have tendencies associated with neurodiversity. You know, by that point I had left. So, you know, that then triggered all of that educational trauma, which then maladapts, and I have problems associated with addictions, which I'm very open and honest about. And I'm, you know, I'm happy to say that I've got 23 years under my belt of sobriety. That's a massive thing. That's part of the reason why I am who I am today. And the connection that I have with people is visceral. So when people present in A&E, they get me. When I present in a school, they get me. When I'm a lecturer, they get me. At the football side of a football field, as you well know, you know, they get me. So I don't change. I don't have that ability to hide, because that isn't part of my nature. I can't profess to be something that doesn't become true, because it runs out within about half an hour. I can pretend to be really appropriate, you know, and then within about 2 seconds of being, you know, at an event, my wife will be like, my goodness, why did you have to declare that? Why did you have to do that? And I can't assess that. I don't understand that that's not appropriate, because I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, no, you don't know what you're talking about. So I'll say it. So it can be problematic.
Yeah, I mean, as an adult, it's problematic, and often we've got a toolbox of stuff that we can use in certain situations to sort of guide. I say that as adults, most adults would, and I know like there'll be times when we don't. But when you're like a young child or an adolescent who going through all those other things you have to go through, whether it's puberty, peer pressure, all those things that are particularly secondary school, how did you manage in those moments when, you know, you don't feel like it's really working for you, and you don't have control of those moments when people are telling you one thing, but you know it's different for you? How do you cope?
So I would say navigationally, I found the company of women. Essentially, I found that the conversational narrative, there was a depth to it. My peer friends wouldn't understand it, or they all thought that I was some sort of like, you know, player that was with all of these different women all the time. So the reality was I just really enjoyed talking and listening and finding out about things. And I felt there was a limitation to that. And so I spent a lot of time in the company of women, and still really, you know, would suggest that that's where the third book that we've sort of talked about. So you've got The Wandering Lamb, which is the formation of unconditional love. Essentially, Richard, we don't love ourselves. You know, when you ask a group of people, you are adults or children, you know, do you tell yourself nice things? Children and adults alike, there's a very low percentage now that actually just say, do you know what, I'm a good person. When I go in and I speak to educators about my children, I ask them 2 questions, which is firstly, do they seem to be enjoying themselves? And secondly, are they kind to their peers? Like, they're the 2 questions. Doesn't matter about anything else. Is the educational journey one that's enjoyable for them? If it's not, then you need to think about a blended learning journey. You know, I'm kinesthetic. I'm also visual. When they did my assessment, I'm in the top 0.1% in the world in terms of spatial and pattern recognition. So I'm one of those kind of people that didn't fit the box, but continue to malleate. And, you know, someone asked me the other day, if you were to look at the Marvels, who would you most liken yourself to? And I said, it's absolutely obvious to me that I am Loki of storytelling. I've decided to kind of go into this space now of subconsciousness, where I go and I drag the stories of others. I know I'm trapped in that space, but I know that I can have an impact in the stories that others tell. And I was so affected by that final image of him sitting on the throne and the Norwegian tree. And I'm Norwegian and well, an Irish in heritage. And books like the Anamkara, which if I find books, they're not just books for me, they're actually friends, and they stay with me. And the Anamkara is a book that I use regularly, and it's written by John O'Donoghue, and it's got the most beautiful statement right at the beginning, which I will try and read to you, although something has spilt in the book which makes it particularly sticky. Hold on. And it's just a really beautiful statement, because it tells us the voice that we sort of tend to ignore. And it says, "It is strange to be here. The mystery never leaves you alone. Behind your image and below your words, above your thoughts, the silence of another world waits. A world lives within you. No one else can bring you news of this inner world." There's actually ways in which we can kind of start to sort of talk to ourselves and be kind to ourselves, but we prove historically that we don't want to do it. And I think that's really problematic. And I think that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from. That's where the challenging behavior comes from. And there's an animation that I can send you that would help people understand that for neuroatypical people, we live outside of the realms of normality that others take for granted.
So there's like there's something. Yeah, I remember talking to you. It's probably 3 years ago, or maybe 2.5, 3 years ago, about your work, and there was a question about, like, you're going to do all of this, and you're going to get to the PhD, and you're going to get all the recognition that you deserve for it. And it's always like, and I think I was going through a bit of a journey myself. It's like, if you get to that point, there's another question, is there? And then what? What's next? You're going to reach your goal, and then what's next? And we both started talking about legacy. Like, it's not the end point, because I don't think there is one. I think it goes. It's an infinite journey, and that's the point of legacy, is that it's something that lives and grows beyond you, and it transcends everything else. What would that really look like if you created something now? And I feel like you're taking huge strides towards whatever that is. I was talking about you becoming a poet in residence in some Kent schools. Like, what's the dream? Where are we heading?
So I know, and I can tell you how it's going to be, and this is a really weird thing about it. I've got my original journals here from when I was doing my undergraduate, right? So they're the original journals, and within them there are statements that effectively define, me wanting to be educated by someone like me in the future. So I created the me for others, and it's exactly the same now, where I believe that what I need is an arts fellowship, which will give me a significant sum of money, which takes away that fear of money and funding. And then I can go out to the UK into particular areas, and I can embed the values associated with the work that I've done in terms of the multiple realms of thinking. Because if you look at it like a Venn diagram, there's an existence in the middle of that sort of positionality, which is like, I have an element of early monastic thinking and training with a good friend of mine, Brother Bernard, who was a Franciscan monk, which is a really unusual relationship to build as a teen, asking him questions about love and society. So I had that period of learning, and then you have like sort of the sort of academic sphere of learning as well, where I've kind of learnt to apply myself to the expectations associated with things like a master's and a PhD, and support kind of people as much as I possibly can do through their own independent journeys. And then there's the arts element, and the arts element are my way of then speaking back, and the poetry is very visceral. And behind me we've got a poem that I sort of co-constructed with some year 6 students at Bridge, and this here is their reflections of poems in the shape of the Alice in Wonderland dress, because whenever I go anywhere, the Hatter's hat comes with me. I've lost it. It's disappeared, but here it is. The Hatter's hat is a really important symbol for me. The Hatter's hat is representative of a lot of the positionality that I think society doesn't really recognise and understand. So C.S. Lewis, I don't read like the Screwtape Diaries. There are the works of C.S. Lewis. He wrote a lot of them actually as an alias, because he was so conscious of what people would think of him, because he talked about all sorts of really sort of dark subconscious ideologies. Same with Tolkien, same with these great thinkers and polymaths effectively. But C.S. Lewis was taking us on a journey of understanding, because the Hatter was turned mad by industry. He wasn't he didn't wake up with madness. What happened was he worked on the felting, and the felting had a chemical in it called magnesium. And Mad as a Hatter, if you look it up historically, they were known to go mad. They would have shakes, visual and auditory hallucinations.
Wow,
so eventually the industry made them go mad.
Wow.
Education as indoctrination is what Chomsky says. We need to move into a new sphere of thinking, and I would like to be able to take the work of amazing people, and the book What If by Ken Robinson, just unbelievable thinkers. I want to take that legacy forward. You can't let those things die, and I want to be one of the ones at the forefront going to conferences and saying, well, I'm an example of the child that you're throwing out of the classroom. I'm an example of the child that you're putting into isolation. I'm an example of the child that you don't necessarily want at a social gathering, that you're trying to quieten down all the time, when you realize that actually it's societal structures that cause the madness and the eccentricity, then maybe you will consider and look at it in a different way.
So is this like I talk a lot with, I don't think I talk with, I'm going to say broken teachers. When I talk to them, they're not broken anymore. Like they put themselves back together. But when we go back through the journey away from teaching and into business or tuition or whatever it might be, in some cases it's into C-suites of large organizations. Some of these guys end up being like chief finance officers or chief operations officers, really quite like prestigious jobs.
Yeah.
Is there an element that the system is broken, or is just the system exists, right?
Systems exist. We don't need to change that inherently. The system, it's just that the default the system goes back to. So there's a really good example that I can give as a way of kind of making sense of that, which is we had an unbelievably brilliant person, a visiting fellow, come down to the university who was a specialist in Lego and play therapy. And what she does is she takes that manipulation of meaning. So she takes that Lego into spaces that would otherwise see that as kind of a rhetoric of play. That's what children do. She takes it to large boardrooms. She makes those CEOs take off all of their identification of ego, so they're not allowed to wear their watches, and they're like, they have to strip themselves down. So you flatten the hierarchy. Flattened hierarchy is a good thing. I don't recognize structures necessarily, so I will just go straight and see the VC. I won't necessarily go through 16 people and request an appointment. I'll be like, if I see him, I'll be like, I want to talk to you. Because I don't necessarily feel that there is a problem with that. Obviously, they're at liberty to say yes or to say no. But I would suggest that there needs to be an understanding. And do you know what? There's another amazing example, Rich, that you will absolutely love. If you go on to BBC iPlayer, I hope it's still there, and you put into it unemployable me, there's this positionality where they were looking at people who were long-term unemployed, and they realized that there was an issue with not being able to find them structural employment. And they had this guy that was an autistic savant, right? So he was never going to fit the expectations, because he would never be able to get through interview, right? Because they'd be like, what do you want to do? And he'd be like, so they'd be like, well, we're not going to be able to do this, right? Because they didn't have the ability and the foresight to really look at his skill set. Anyway, as a chance encounter, he ended up going to this technology firm which had this massive problem with their data inputting, because basically their systems weren't working effectively. They'd spent thousands, hundreds of thousands, right? So there were like 40 people there on massive salaries that were involved in making sure that this data, gold data, algorithms, AI, that's what we're all into now, right? So this golden thread was like going to be perfect, and it just wasn't working. And they had thousands of pounds, and they had this guy go in, and within half an hour, Rich, bearing in mind 40 people on a full-time salary, within half an hour this autistic savant went, that's the problem there. And they were like, no, we've been through that. And he goes, well, look at this. And he rewrote the code. He went backwards all the way through the code, and he went, there's your gate. Yep, doesn't work there. And as soon as they changed that gate, everything, their whole system lit up, right? Like a Christmas tree, right? So he then, the guy that owned the company, put him on an overarching contract. He said, what do you want to be paid? Like, we'll pay you whatever you want, within reason, as like you would do, salary match to one of our, and we don't have to have you here. You can come in when you want, you can leave when you want, and you don't need to be contractually obliged to turn up, basically. We'll call you when there's a problem. Like, those people are out there, and I'm saying that's an example of something like the top end. Think of it like a spectrum, but at the moment we've just got a default window. And I'm right in the middle of that default window at the moment because I'm rebellious and I'm a vulgarist and I'm trying to take information from one place and take it somewhere else. I've got, this play that may be being taken up by the Arts Council England. I've got all of these different elements, but I love that. I love the opposition. I love argument. So I am a nightmare for people because not only do I know their language now, I know it better than they do. I will explain it in a deeper metaphor. Even when I do recognize, and I wrote a piece called Humility and Grace because I read a journal article that was just better than mine. His thinking was so much deeper. A guy called Michael Trainer, who really understood the work of Zizek. If you know these guys, they are properly impenetrable pieces of work, philosophy that goes way beyond what the majority can handle, because effectively the work I'm reading now is like my ultra marathons that I do. I'm now doing one for my mind. So it's like that level, if you want. And I think that causes a certain amount of fear. You have to accept that. But we don't like it within education systems, and we don't allow for that position of safety. And that's all that I'm introducing. Not only am I introducing it in schools, I'm now trying to introduce it within the university for those people who are first time in university, black ethnic minority groups, people with marginalized communities, people who've got hidden disabilities. So I'm going to create almost like what I liken it to is like an Avengers school, like to sort of harness those super powers, like the X-Men. Like I'll have a place where they can come and see me. We can deconstruct their trauma so they understand it. And the reason I know it works, Rich, is because I did it with a lad who was another really good example. If you've got, the time to hear these amazing examples, this lad was really heavily autistic. Okay. And he was really struggling with the process. And he was going out into practice and he was just saying things because there were two actually. And the blog called, I think it's Diamonds. There's a blog really early on, which is written by me and this amazing girl with Asperger's, who I managed to find a home within hospital because they were being so horrible to her. Anyway, this lad was Asperger's as well. With Asperger's, you just say what you see, which is like, yeah, Rich, those glasses don't suit you, man. And it's really horrible because you're like, hold on, that's not fair. I really like them, right? Because they're saying what they think. It's like,
you need to take that back in a minute.
I will take it back, mate. It's all right. I know mine are like goggles. Don't worry. Look at those bad boys. They make my eyes about 4 times too big. Sarah says I look like a tortoise. So you're not allowed to say anything back. Because it will hurt my feelings. But anyway, he was going into these environments and saying things that weren't untrue, but they needed to be guided. And so what I said to him was like, take that stuff and bring it back to me. But he was in the cardiac catheter suite, okay, and he was able to read the ECG reporting software. So he was able to not only diagnose the patient, right? He was a student in his 3rd year. They gave him the reporting book and he read it overnight, and then he came back in and he diagnosed 2 of the patients in the cardiac catheter suite, and they had to take them through to have an ablation earlier than they would have done, and pacing, because he identified a Mobilitz type 2 complex. Now, people clinically will understand what I'm talking about, and that is unbelievably fantastic, because that's someone potentially not dying. Right. So I then said, like, look, let's mediate that. I helped him get an educator and we've got him in the right place, and there's every chance he'll end up becoming a cardiologist. Yes, but he will be problematic because he's not going to see the world in the same way. So make allowances for these individuals because they're the ones that are going to change the future course of humanity.
That's what I believe as well. I'm down the same path as you. I'm in a much, I suppose, lower level with the children that I work with. But I when I left school and left education, what I was known for was setting up a nurture group and having a very nurturing personality and approach to teaching. So what I was attracting when I was marketing the business was those sorts of families who was looking for that support. That was my energy that I was putting out there. And what I noticed at that level was that once you start giving them the time and the space that they need to either think in the way they need to think and grow in the way that they need to grow, there was nothing holding them back. So if we're on one hand saying the system says they don't belong, we can't do it. And I've heard this as recently within the last 3 weeks from a friend of a friend whose child's been not excluded, but actually just kicked out of school, which I don't know another word that really means that other than just excluded, because in their words, we don't have the tools to support your child. So that's not the child's fault, and this child is 5 years old.
Yeah.
5 years old, and so I think, well, I don't know what the answer is to that in the short term, other than like you say, I think the systems would always exist. Like the system needs to change somewhat.
Sir, I know. I think I know. Can I
Yeah,
answer?
you're in, mate.
All right. Okay. Oh, I forgot we weren't in a classroom, right? So it's always going to put your hand up, haven't you? Yeah, because you can't interrupt anyone, right? So essentially, you need to create two streams of education. Like, it doesn't need to take away from the realities of the streams that exist there, but you need to allow more and more free schools to open up. You need to allow people like me to come in and say, well, actually, no, the child doesn't have to come in whenever they want. They can mediate their own opportunities within education, and they can choose how they want their education. It's basically student-led learning. It is happening across the UK, and guess what? It's happening globally. There's so many places now where they don't assess children. There's so many examples across Germany, the Nordic Isles, and like I said, that culturally, I've realized I'm more of a sensory thinker, and I express myself in emotions, and that's very much associated with kind of a Norwegian sensibility, because they have like words like hyggelig, which means to be cozy, that they have blankets everywhere. So they have sensibilities that are different culturally. And I think that we need to be less like British about it and think, oh, well, we've got our system, and our system is not fit for purpose. And, guys like Chomsky have suggested, but we still revert back. That's not to suggest there aren't places that are doing excellent work. And I think it's about promoting those positions of excellence, because what you don't want to do is become so rebellious that everyone looks at you and says, well, they're marginalized, that one, because they just are going to break things. No, what you're doing is take a percentage, like I've said to you today, and I sent you that email about, right, this is what I want to do. How can I functionally do it? I want to go into those schools and impact those children and deconstruct their traumas now so that they unmask. Now, we've had examples across 5 schools. You can ask each of those independent heads that the behaviour change has been evident within each of those children, because they've been seen, and they would not necessarily have had that change and ability. And if they don't carry that in, I don't form friendships, relationships. They're not normal for me. I don't understand them. They seem to be sort of commodity led, like, oh, I've got to do this for you, and then you're my friend, and I didn't ever understand that. That's why I sort of avoided it as much as possible. But that also leads to maladaptation, because you want to be social. So how can you become social? So I had to buy myself into that social experience. And I'm not going to suggest how I did that, because I don't want to kind of impugn myself on the podcast, but it wasn't a positive way, and I've, told you that in privacy, so it's like, I understand that the route to criminality as well, and the longitudinal studies are horrendous. If you look at the number of people incarcerated that haven't even been assessed, if we actually had the genuine assessments done, you would realize that what we're actually doing is we're criminalizing people who don't fit the social normities, so then have to perform crime in order to try to get the materialism that other people have got. And then the joke is, you've got top tier, nepotistic, poisoned politicians who can just do whatever they want, because they can just buy legal impunity and responsibility out, so they can just break rules. And recently they've even looked at the political mandate in terms of like how they work, and they had to rewrite truth because they were able to malleate the truth. No, there's a big problem there, and societally we know that. But I think when everyone starts sort of saying things, that rebellious nature can lead to a cancel culture, and I don't necessarily want to be part of that. I want to be part of that system of change. So it's like, where do you talk? But my history and my family are heavily rooted in politics in the UK. The welfare state was started by, it was Baba's uncle, so my granddad's uncle. So it's like, I understand those positions. My granddad, William Yates, was an MP. So I do understand it, but I don't want to be involved in that position, because within that you become part of that toxic ecosystem. And like I was saying to someone the other day, if you take oxygen out of an ecosystem, you lose kind of the culture of life. If you take light out of the system, everything dies out. And there's loads of work around Jung and around Nietzsche, around the void and around darkness of the subconscious. And that's one of the areas that I am massively exploring with my play and my poetry. And I'm asking now for neurosensitive psychodynamic therapy to really unpick those positions of knowing. That causes fear. People get scared of those things, but I just don't. That's not something that scares me. And I think that's part of the fact that I probably forget that I've been there. So I think there's something about the dyslexic that's a real benefit. Trauma-wise, I was the ADHD when I was in A&E, it would flood my frontal cortex. So when everyone else would panic, I would be like, a chilled out little dude that would just be going around getting everything done so the person didn't die. And so it was absolutely in keeping with my skill set. Hence the reason I lived there in that ecosystem for 10 years, and I still miss it because they're my people. So it's a weird thing, isn't it? Education needs to move people, but quite often what it can do is it can just continue to funnel and limit people to a point of criminality.
I've got a little bit of a story with this, because one of the reasons I always wanted to be a teacher from about the age of about 17, but without really the overall intention to go and get it done. I was doing some other courses or whatever, and I worked for Sure Start when I was early 20s, and we had a project running in Canterbury Prison. I know, Rich, because I was running dads groups back then in the community. And I was like, do you want to go and do it? Because it's basically working with dads in prison, keeping them in contact with their children. And I was like, yeah. And the whole project was about reading stories, basically. That was it. So we went out, spent loads of money on books, instruments, recording equipment. I rock up for the first day, absolutely bricking it. No one could read. They all came in, and we had all of these amazing books and stories and stuff. And I was like, well, what do you want us to do? And I was like, well, I want you to read. Well, we can't. And then over that project lasted for about 6 months. And over the 6 months, I just met so many different people who were like, good. It's really hard to say, I don't know them overall, but they weren't what I thought they were going to be.
No.
And because I was a young man myself, and I suppose I'd never really had anything to do with that kind of world. I just had a judgment in my head. And then I had a guy come and help me out, an inmate come and help me out. I can't remember his name. And over the course of 3 months he was with me, he just gave me such a different insight into everything. He was saying basically, look, actually I want to go out and do good in the world, but I can't even write an application form. I can't articulate myself in a way that's going to allow me to get a job. But however, I still want to be able to go out on a weekly basis and buy food for my family and buy a TV that sits on the wall, or drive a car, or I still want the same things everybody else has. And it was the first time I felt a sense of total injustice. Look, the guy was like, yeah, of course I did what I did, and I was guilty, and that's why I'm here. But I was like, what happens after when you're out? Because we're at Canterbury, and the prison's not there anymore, but it was like the holding place before people were released. And he was like, I will go back to crime because I don't have a choice. If I want to have money, that's the only thing I have.
Because we're based in a materialist culture now, and the problem with that is the materialist reality has taken over so strong that people can't deconstruct that to the point where they realize it doesn't matter. As long as you have, and I talk about Maslow, I spoke about it with you guys, when we were gathered around that table for that interesting conversation that we had. But the Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs, the reality of the principial knowing. And actually, I put something on LinkedIn. It's worth following my LinkedIn, because I put something on.
I'll share your link tree, Tom.
Yeah, that's the best thing to do. Yeah, share the link tree, because then people can, and obviously, buy the book and I'll sign it. So it's it says this: allowing a student with a hidden disability, ADHD, anxiety, or dyslexia to struggle academically or socially when all that is needed for success are appropriate accommodations and explicit instructions is no different than failing to provide a ramp for a person in a wheelchair.
Yeah,
it's so brilliant, right? The problem with hidden disabilities is, for too long, it's been easy to subvert the kind of truth. Microaggressions are all over. I'm sustaining that right now, but I have to be a bit careful with how much kind of detail I go into, because it's heavily associated with my employment. And I think that it's very difficult because you marginalize and you become vulnerable, and it just, I couldn't believe I read this article. I can't find it. Someone needs to go out there and find it for me. But there was an article written by a Cambridge publishing house, and I couldn't believe I was reading it. So it was anthropologically, they've looked at the movement of human beings, right? So they've looked at the likely, and I've written a blog about it recently called 2000 Years of Consciousness. And it's like when you think about anthropology, you think about the earliest form of man, and you can look at Sapiens by Johann Hari. You can look at all of these amazing books that talk to you about the position of knowing. But what they've said is the movement of humans was not a linear patternation. It wasn't normalized. It was very sporadic. They wouldn't move in normal patterns of behavior. They've seen and they've looked at where they've charted their movements, and they've suggested the leaders at that time were most likely to have neurosensitive traits. So your leaders of anthropology were autistic and dyslexic, and what you've done is you've pushed them to the margins as so it's called the Cartesian duality, as the reality of writing things down became a dominance. And for the dyslexic, the biggest problem for the dyslexic is black on white. Right, that is how everything academically is written. Everything is written in this kind of normalized language of reference truth. But the truth really is that we need to open up those spheres of thinking for more people to come through. So my intent is to smash a few of those doors open and then allow others to come behind me. And the more doors I can smash open as a legacy, and the more destructuring I can do in schools, the more likely we are to reach points of solution for so many kind of massive kind of world-ending problems that we are facing. Let's be true. Society isn't in a good place. We've just been through a global pandemic that proved effectively that the education was a slightly default system, because children actually, guess what? All of the behavior traits of all of those children that were unable to sit in school suddenly got better. And actually quite a few of them never came back into school systems. A large percentage then ended up being homeschooled, because the reality was you could see the impact was so much better for the parent and and it's like free schools need to be fully advocated. We need more understanding, but the problem is you're talking about default, and you're talking about the reality of how funding is kind of marginalized and packaged, and effectively you need a government that recognize both a health and an education system as being valuable.
Yeah. And then back it up, like you say, with funding.
Yeah.
But the idea, I love the idea of having a second system. That's the way what we don't need to do is break down the other system, because for the other system, there can be tweaks, and there will always be ways to make it better. But actually, what we need to do is look at this other group.
Or a hybrid model that allows more flexibility, so we continue to try and don't worry about failure. I'm hoping eventually the book that I'll write will be a fantastic failure, which is about how I've kind of continued to fail beautifully. And there's a great book called Falling Upwards, which is what I tend to do. I tend to make intentional stumbles, not intentional, but I recognize things within patterns. So if I submit something, so my PhD, I'm failing it brilliantly. That's what I say to people. My PG cap, I got a mark of 50, 50 and 50 on the transcript, but behind that, I achieved 78, 90 and 95%, because what I was able to do was I was able to understand what they wanted. I couldn't from the binary learning outcomes, because they were too easy to misinterpret. And I did, I do misinterpret things. I do get things wrong. But the one thing I will do is I'm just a real nightmare, because I'm so stubborn and so happy to be put under immense pressure. And A&E was a absolutely beautiful kind of sort of learning space for that, because not only in New Zealand, where I had to relearn everything and reapply it all, and I did fall in love with the culture out in New Zealand. I think that's where I want to spend some of my research time or sabbatical time, is out there with my wife and kids and all the rest of it. But there's so many opportunities out there. Canada also are very forward thinking. There's an amazing woman called Erin Manning, who hopefully is going to explain and examine some of the work for the doctorate, and she understands that polymath nature, making sure there are opportunities. MIT do exactly what we're talking about, right? So MIT, they put it through a color wheel, and so what they do is they take an idea and they put it through as many different thinkers as possible, because they know that what they get at the end is a much stronger, more sustainable model, because you put it through engineering, arts, creative enterprises, social, you put it through all of these different places. organics, humanism. You put it through so many places, and then you have something really tangible as a result.
There's, I think we should start to wrap up, Tom. What I'm thinking of, there were some values you said at the beginning which I really liked, and I've kind of attached myself to them for the time being, which was being seen, being valued, being unmasked. Right, so there's three things there which actually relate to what you were talking about at school, and then underneath that I've written adults, because I feel that like yourself, like in our generation, there would be lots of us who went through, I'd say lots of us, I don't include myself in that, lots of people who went through education and experienced it in a similar way as what you did. And I think I've said this to you before, I think there's work which again transcends school. I think it's well suited to schools, don't get me wrong. I think it's where you can make the most amount of change. But I think there's people who need to be seen, valued and unmasked at our age and above. And the power behind that to impact somebody's life later on, knowing that there's trauma in the past as well. Is there anything around that you've seen? Because you work with young adults now at uni as we didn't say this, but you're a lecturer at Christchurch University.
Yeah.
Is there, and also Teacher of the Year?
Yeah, I won the Times Higher Education Award for the most innovative teacher 2019. Yeah. So yeah, which was amazing. Yeah, absolutely. And as you're talking, I know, I can see, this is the thing with the sort of mind that I have, is as you're saying those things, I'm funneling them into these positions of knowing. And the reality is actually that what we need is the psychological safety. So we need to create these positions of psychological safety so that we can then try to bond with what people are trying to express, and actually what you've really helped me do is defend my viva. Like, I've just done a viva, so imagine you're one of the examiners and you've asked me questions about, well, where does that position itself, Tom? What does that do? The first thing I'm going to succeed at is narratively. Like, it's said in my report from the Chaucer Technology School, Tom's too chatty. I'm still too chatty. It's also said Tom's spelling is really bad. My spelling is still appalling. Tom's handwriting is appalling. My spelling and my handwriting are never going to change. They are awful. I tried to make a new version of handwriting where I just did capitalization. I tried to and then I just joined them up. So it's completely illegible,
Hieroglyphics,
yeah, absolutely horrendous, right? So, so it's like I completely understand those positions of trauma. I'm one of the people that survived that trauma, understands it at a level that that will help sort of whole system change, and I'm excited about that because I can see that there are balances. And we're moving, we are moving in the right direction. And it's just, I went up to Bridge School today and I spoke with a teacher, a really forward-thinking teacher called Helen Allison. Massive shout out, because she was one of the ones that accepted the transcendental poetry walk. Not many people would be like, oh yeah, let this guy come in and just go on a walk with the kids and then talk about poetry. Yeah, everything was followed as far as the school's kind of safety process, and we went for this walk, and what they created was this poem, and it is unbelievable. It talks the falling leaves, the sweet apple trees, oh beautiful nature, the summer rain, the swirling fresh gain, oh beautiful nature. It's just, you just have to create the space of deconstruction. And that's what I do. I flatten it. And I was in a Chollock school recently, Mrs. Sweet, again, an exceptional head. She really has embodied and accepted the position that I've come in with. Same with Lady Joanna Thornhill. Same, so these schools are really important to me. What's more important is they can see the behaviour change in the child. I don't have to find them. The wandering lamb comes and finds me. And the point of the wandering lamb is he's followed by the butterfly farmer. So there's actually a whole value centre for education that they can embed, so they can take the wandering lamb, they can read it, and they can say that they love it themselves, and then they can move into the butterfly farmer, which is a positional piece of poetry, which is about an educational culture, and then we move into the final book as well, which is just being structured. So there's this 3-point narrative, if you want. And so I know I can help. I know I can help with systems and structures, but the problem is you have to be seen to be heard. And a lot of these guys that end up in prison, like, I'm fortunate that I didn't receive some sort of a custodial sentence when I was maladapting as a teenager. Teens and young adults are just trying to make sense of the world. And all we do is we put blocks in the way and we say, well, you shouldn't really be going there. You shouldn't be doing that. You're not good enough to do that. And the amount of self-deprecating language spoken over me as a kid through educators saying, we don't really want you in this room. I was put in special needs education because I was asking questions about education. I was asking questions about poetry, ironically, and I was segregated because that they could do that back then without telling anyone. My parents had no idea. So it's really important that we understand those paradigms of thinking to help the educator know that it's not their fault, and also to help the learner know that it's not their fault. And it's like a mediation process. That's where the psychological safety comes in, and that's where the Hatter comes in. The C.S. Lewis was giving us a blueprint. The Screw Tape Diaries are unbelievable. There are so many works out there that are like a roadmap for us, a bit like the labyrinth that's used in kind of spiritual ideologies, and I know you were part of that project that I did where everyone came into that space, quite an unusual sort of pilot project, but actually a massive example of what you can do. So there's something huge on the horizon, I know. And I know that having people like potentially Cambridge and Pam Bernard will be massively influential because there'll be funding that will come with that. But more importantly, I know the values because I lived them. That book is written to me as a child to heal the educational harm that I sustained, and probably others are sustaining today and tomorrow and the next day.
I'm a big advocate. You know that, like, we talk a lot about this and the future and the impact it can leave and what it might look like. We often talk about, or you often talk about, what it could be like in 10 years' time and what a centre might be, or the free school. And it's out there as an idea, but I feel like you say, you have to smash down doors to get this. To get this working, I suppose, and also to allow other people to follow you through it. I'm always filled with joy after we talk about this kind of thing, because one of the reasons why education started to become or create friction in my life was because I wasn't really on board with the values of it anymore, and it was hard to try to push back, but you just hit a brick wall. So in this case, I think, and many of us that will be watching or listening to this will also feel the same way. And then when you manage to smash the door down, you're going to have an audience of people behind you just waiting to make that hole even greater, so that we'll all flood into that new space that you create. So Tom, with as much love as I can give you, I think we're all behind you. And this won't be the last time that we broach this subject. We'll probably come at it from a different angle in 6 months to 12 months time. We'll keep everybody up to date with it. And also when the next book comes out as well, which I know is in production, exciting. And you've got your illustrator on board right now. It's all happening in the background. But you have our support, mate. And I appreciate your time here.
Love as well. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
So thanks, mate. We'll speak soon.
Yes.